a long time ago, and I mean a very long time ago, Norway was full of giants. Now this was a situation left over from the time of the gods, when there was Utgard and Asgard. Utgard was the giants' own territory, where they lived pretty happily. They were a bit dim and a bit slow, but they lived pretty happily, unless one of them should stray into Asgard, which was the realm of the gods. Or indeed, if one of the gods fancied a bit of a violent foray into Utgard, Thor was the most likely candidate for this. He liked nothing more than smashing a few giants to pieces with his mighty hammer Mjolnir. In the Prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson wrote that after Ragnarök, the battle to end all battles, both gods and giants all perished. This isn't quite true. Some of the giants were so slow to arrive to Ragnarök that by the time they got there, all the fighting had finished, and they were left wandering a bare wasteland, waiting for the world as we know it today to begin. And when the world as we know it today did begin, and humans arrived in Norway for the first time, that is why they found it to be full of giants. Now, humans and giants lived pretty well alongside each other. There was the odd argument when, for example, a lady giant took a shine to a gentleman human. Such things are perhaps bound to happen. Or if a giant should stick their head above the parapet, pretty easy to do, and cause havoc for giants and humans. And Thrym was one such giant. Now, he lived very high up in the mountains, so for a long time didn't cause much trouble. But over time, his hatred for humans grew, and he began to make more frequent trips down the mountainside to unsuspecting farmsteads and townships. And he would roar, "I'm going to find you. I'm going to catch you. I'm going to eat you." And find them and catch them and eat them he did. He tore off their heads and sucked out their vital juices and left their bones scattered by the sides of the road. Now, after some time, this situation became pretty intolerable to both giants and humans. Giants were pretty mortified that one of their own was causing such havoc, and humans lived in fear of their lives. So an emergency council was convened, and a vote was held, and it was decided to expel Thrym from Norway. Thrym wasn't too bothered by this decision, and he set off south into the North Sea, shouting, "I'm going to find you. I'm going to catch you. I'm going to eat you." Now, the North Sea was much shallower in those days. It only came up to about his knees. So after a couple of days wading, he arrived in Shetland. Now, Shetland at that time was full of trows or trolls, and their blood is very thick and very green and very bitter, and wasn't at all to Thrym's liking. So he didn't stay there very long, and he set off again south, passing Fair Isle, no point stopping there, more trows, and arrived into Orkney, where he did indeed find humans. So after spending some time there, rampaging around, he then set off south again. Some of the humans in Orkney had managed to escape via boat to the shore that we now know as Caithness in the north of Scotland. This situation with Thrym, incidentally, is why the Vikings were so easily able to invade Orkney a few thousand years later, because it was completely devoid of people. But anyway, back to Thrym, who was chasing the refugees across the Pentland Firth. And Thrym ate his way through Caithness and Sutherland and into Wester Ross, where the people of Applecross heard a mighty roar from beyond the top of Sgur a Churachin at the top of the Bialach. "I'm going to find you. I'm going to catch you. I'm going to eat you." Now, the people of Applecross didn't particularly want to be found and caught and eaten, but they knew something of what might be to come, because for weeks now refugees had been arriving into Applecross, full of stories of this bloodthirsty giant. In fact, the situation was becoming quite dire. The village was overcrowded and there were shortages of food. Some folk were all for rounding up the refugees and shipping them off on boats over to Skye and over to Rasay. But instead, the community council held a meeting and a plan was hatched. All of the villagers gathered together and began digging a very wide and very deep hole at just about where Applecross campsite is now. And into this hole they felled a few dozen trees and sharpened them into stakes. And then they sent a half dozen of the cheekiest Applecross children up to the top of Sgwr a Chyrrakain to goad and taunt the giant. And it wasn't long before their insults about his size and intelligence, or lack thereof, had the desired effect. And over the top of the Bialach came Thrym, thundering, "I'm going to find you. I'm going to catch you. I'm going to eat you." Now the children knew that mountain like the back of their hand, and they skipped pretty happily back down to the safety of the village. Whereas Thrym stumbled and fell his way down the mountain. And as he neared the village, the townsfolk held out a tripwire at just about his ankle height, which he didn't see because giants are famously short-sighted. And he fell headlong into the pit and was gored on the spikes. The villagers set about collecting every blade they could get their hands on, from hatchets to penknives, and then began dismembering Thrym's body into hundreds of pieces. And when that was done, they stood back to admire their handiwork, and then they retired to the Applecross Inn to drink themselves silly and pat themselves on the back. As they staggered home in the early hours of the morning, in fact it was a bit later than that, sometime in the night, nobody can quite remember when, that an eerie, disembodied voice was heard. "I'm going to find you. I'm going to catch you. I'm going to eat you." At dawn, all the villagers gathered at the pit, and lo and behold, all the hundreds of pieces of Thrym's body were jiggling around, very much alive. As quickly as they could, the villagers began gathering as much dry firewood as they could get their hands on, and brought seaweed from the beach and piled it into the pit and set it alight. And when the blaze was going quite well, they piled in peats and built a huge fire that burned for most of the day, until finally it began to die down to a very thick but fine layer of ash at the bottom of the pit. At which point the villagers retired to the Applecross Inn to drink themselves silly and pat themselves on the back. As they left the pub a few hours later, a faint breeze lifted a few specks of ash and blew them in their direction. And the villagers turned to watch, and these few specks became a huge cloud, and they seemed to hear hundreds of thousands of very tinny, high-pitched, whining voices. "I'm going to find you. I'm going to catch you. I'm going to eat you." The villagers turned to run, and the cloud followed, intent on eating them, because of course these were the very first Highland Midges. And although they began life in Applecross, they soon spread across the whole of the Highlands looking for more humans to eat. And we live with them to this very day. And of course it wouldn't be summer without them, let's face it.